This lecture is part of the Keystone seminar at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. The text and author for discussion in this lecture is George Orwell, and specifically his book, The Road to Wigan Pier. I've chosen this book as part of the course because I think it does a good job at addressing some of the shortcomings of the philosophical ideas that we have explored over the last couple of weeks of the course. John Locke, for instance, talked about property as this inviolable human right, and to some extent that can be equated even with happiness. Rousseau is less optimistic about the prospects of property, in fact sees that as the origin of inequality, but still, given that property is something that exists as a conception, government must protect that, and even if it continues with inequality. Well, we saw in Veblen that in the modern industrial period, at least according to Veblen's conception of historical development, that certain people were able to obtain exponentially more in terms of possessions than most of the rest of the population, and this led them to establish new norms of decorum and dignity that correspond with the terms conspicuous leisure and conspicuous consumption. That is the kind of elite side of that equation, or of that problem. Orwell, in The Road to Wigan Pier and a couple of his other works, explores the other side. He explores the life of the poor, and suggests, I think, that the poor are the ones who are left behind in this whole equation of the inviolability of property, and so he takes up to some extent the same sort of subject as Veblen did. He just does it by exploring poverty as a condition rather than by exploring wealth and conspicuous consumption. The question that I want to ask for the last couple of weeks of this course is, is this system of thought that stands at the heart of the political and social system that we have in the West, and specifically in the United States, is it sufficient? Are there challenges to this that we should address, that we should think about? Should we revise our ideas about what, say, fundamental human rights are? Should we revise our ideas about property and the necessity of property? Should we revise our ideas about human nature and questions of identity and questions of place? Are some places inherently more valuable than others? Is, say, a luxury hotel built in the 1880s by Henry Flagler, which now is part of Flagler College, is that place somehow more valuable, such that people can be excluded from that place by the likes of Henry Flagler, whereas the mines of northern England, or the factories, the houses of the poor that Orwell writes about, are these places somehow less valuable? So hopefully we can connect all of these conceptions that we've been dealing with for the whole term as we explore this book. And then after this, we're going to take up the question of race and ask if race presents a formidable, maybe an insurmountable challenge to these conceptions at the heart of the Western political systems. So let's talk about George Orwell. I'm not going to give a historical background here because his life in many ways is a study in the trends of the early 20th century. So I'm going to cut directly to discussing his life. Orwell was born Eric Arthur Blair in 1903, actually born in India, which was at the time part of the British Empire. His family was there, though they did move back to England when he was relatively young. And Blair himself, anyway, he was a product very much of the British Empire. Britain, from the late 19th century on, with antecedents going all the way back into the 17th and 18th centuries, had a stake in, well, vast portions of the earth. They had established colonies and protectorates and spheres of influence. These are all sort of technical terms that we don't necessarily need to go into here. Over vast regions of the world, huge swaths of Asia and Africa, parts of Latin America. Of course, they had lost the colonies, some of their colonies in North America to the American Revolution, but they just shifted their focus after that to controlling, again, large parts of Asia and eventually Africa. The most valuable piece of the colonial puzzle for Britain was India, because of its tremendous productivity in agricultural things, particularly cotton. And so India became the source of raw materials that were sent back to England and made during the Industrial Revolution period into finished products, and then those finished products were sold all over the world, including, very importantly, the colonies of the British Empire, which provided captive markets for those goods. In other words, they were the only business in town, so to speak, who would sell these finished products that were in high demand. This was, in a nutshell, really how the colonial system worked, at least the economy of the colonial system, the extraction of raw materials from the colonial territories, the transport of them back to England, the manufacture of the raw materials into finished products in English factories using English machines, and then the captive markets set up in the colonies to help to distribute the finished products. Now, Orwell was a critic of the British Empire, as we'll see. He did participate in this, and was not always terribly comfortable with it. He was educated at fairly elite schools, most specifically Eton Academy, which is a kind of high society private school in the southern part of England, and he established contacts at Eton that would continue to benefit him throughout his life. One of those contacts actually was with Aldous Huxley, who was a kind of Renaissance man in early 20th century Britain, a novelist, also a political activist, a socialist, and all-around intellectual from a family who had a tremendous intellectual reputation. He taught French for a time at Eton to Eric Arthur Blair, and I don't think it's any surprise that in Orwell's most famous work, 1984, he was influenced probably by Huxley's book Brave New World more than anything else, and that contact may have been the initial source of that. When he reached adulthood, rather than move on, to sort of higher education, to graduate school, to become an academic or something like that, he decided to go back to India as a policeman, and was actually sent to Burma, where he spent time serving the British Empire there. Became a bit disenchanted with some of the facets of his service. Mostly, he said it was just very dull, but he did develop some critical views of the way the British Empire was handling itself that he would later write about. Not, an absolute opponent, I guess, of the British system, but he was headed down the road here to, politically at least, to an embrace of socialism. And I know socialism is, in America, still probably kind of a bad word. Many people are uncomfortable with it, but in the early 20th century in Europe, especially in Britain, this was really quite a a normal thing to be a socialist, and even though it was a bit radical, it wasn't something that earned a person absolute opprobrium from the rest of society. He eventually got fed up with his police service and finished his term of service, returned to England, took up a teaching post for 2 or 3 years, but became somewhat disenchanted with that as well. Part of the reason was that he got pretty sick with pneumonia. This is the early 1930s at this point. And so while he was still teaching, and then after he was released from that job, he entered what we might call his poverty phase. Now, that's not a reference to his own poverty necessarily. Orwell was not a tremendously wealthy man, but he was, I think, fairly comfortable in the middle class. But he developed a fascination with the issue of poverty, and actually began what he called his tramping expeditions, where he would dress up as a homeless person, essentially, and go live for a time in the slums of London, trying to figure out how people thought. And for a time, actually, he moved to Paris in this period and did kind of the same thing in Paris. And so with this experience, he then began to write about poverty, mostly essays, and that's actually where it was in this phase that The Road to Wigan Pier was written. It was kind of the last work of his poverty phase. In 1937-38, sometime along there, when he was in his mid-30s, Orwell joined with the Republican faction in the Spanish Civil War. Now, if you don't know much about the Spanish Civil War, this was in a way a kind of dress rehearsal for the Second World War, in that there was an attempted fascist takeover of Spain in the person of Generalissimo Franco, who had backing from Nazi Germany, among others, and anyway, I mean, this is actually a pretty tremendously complicated conflict, but the Republican faction, the ones who were trying to fight against the spread of fascism, were often outnumbered, and so they began to appeal internationally for help, and many kind of famous people volunteered to go and fight in the Spanish Civil War, and Eric Arthur Blair, or as he was now known by his pen name, George Orwell, decided to go there and fought for a few months on a losing side. Was somewhat uncomfortable with some of the company he kept. There were communist factions, for instance, supporting communist, troops from Russia and other places who were supporting the Republican troops, and Orwell continued to explore socialism, but was not always comfortable with kind of full communism with Marxist orthodoxy that many of these people insisted on. He was wounded by a sniper in the neck and nearly died, and managed to, well, he was sort of rescued from that situation, was treated medically, and eventually, now that he was really kind of unfit health-wise for combat, he managed to escape from Spain in 1938 and returned to England. And probably partly due to his experience in the Spanish Civil War fighting against the forces of fascism, but also becoming disenchanted with communism. He became acquainted in this period of time with the predations of Joseph Stalin. If you don't know anything about this, in the 1920s and 1930s, Joseph Stalin tried to establish agricultural collectives among the people in the Soviet Union, forced a lot of people off of their family farms onto collectives. Often these collectives would have their food taken away once it was grown and there was not enough left for the people who were actually growing the food. Millions of people ended up dying of either starvation or diseases attendant on those sorts of conditions. And this was becoming quite well known in the West at the time. And Orwell, partly through his contact with these communist-leaning troops in the Spanish Civil War, developed into a fierce critic of Joseph Stalin, nearly as much as he critiqued Hitler. He was certainly no fan of fascism either. During World War II, Orwell wrote mostly in his own private writings, in his diary and things like that, about how upset he was that Britain was allied with Soviet Russia and that Churchill was off kind of making plans with Joseph Stalin. This was, to Orwell's mind, quite an unforgivable thing, even if war necessitated it. And so, in any case, this is what Orwell was thinking about from the time of his expedition to Spain, really to the end of his life. The problems of totalitarianism, and the war itself, he began to see as inevitable. When the Second World War began, Orwell was decreed unfit for combat due to his earlier wounds and his many health struggles. It took him months to recover from what had happened to him in Spain. And he eventually did land a job as a reporter for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, though he was limited somewhat in his movement because of his health problems. He did broadcast for a couple of years during the war as part of the BBC. There are famous photographs of Orwell sitting behind a BBC microphone. But he also began in the Second World War to work on a couple of novels that would end up being his most famous ones, Animal Farm in 1984, which are both, in one way or another, commentaries on the problems of totalitarian systems. And so, again, Orwell's life really is a kind of journey through many of the major issues of the early 20th century, the problems of empire and colonialism, the Great Depression, and poverty, and finally the Second World War. His career touched on all of those. This is not an exhaustive list of his works. These are some of his more famous ones. And so from his poverty phase, his earliest work was called Down and Out in Paris and London, published in 1933. That was an essay, kind of an extended essay about living the life of poverty, about the problems faced by those who lived in extreme poverty in these major industrial cities in the West. And he refers in The Road to Wigan Pier repeatedly to the conclusions that he drew in Down and Out in Paris and London, so this remained on his mind. In 1934, he published a novel called Burmese Days, which was in some ways a way to reckon with his experience in Burma as an imperial policeman. And in any case, that was his kind of commentary on the British Empire. In 1936, as part of his poverty phase, he wrote a novel called Keep the Aspidistra Flying, which explores the main character there is a guy who kind of, just to make a point, takes a position as a kind of a menial laborer, a very low-paying job, to make a statement against those who only seek after wealth, so that was, in the form of a novel, his exploration of the the issue of poverty. 1937, he published The Road to Wigan Pier, which is an extended essay on poverty, so this is still part of the poverty phase. And 1938, an account of his time in the Spanish Civil War called Homage to Catalonia, Catalonia being the region of Spain that he spent time in, close to the city of Barcelona. And then, right at the end of the Second World War, he published Animal Farm, which is an allegorical work. I imagine that many students have probably read this. It's, I think, still fairly standard high school and early college reading fare. And then his most famous novel, 1949's book called 1984, which is a grim vision, a dystopian vision of a totalitarian world. Animal Farm was really kind of a comic, allegorical exploration. Orwell hinted that 1984 was written with reference to the way the Russian Revolution went awry. That there were these great ideas at the beginning of the Russian Revolution that inspired Lenin and those who joined with him in the overthrow of the Tsarist absolutist monarchy. But the pigs, who are the kind of the main characters in 1984, or sorry, in Animal Farm, are the ones who begin to change everything, and they end up exploiting everybody that they said they had just led to revolution, to the overthrow of the farmer on the farm, and so the pigs are really his version of Joseph Stalin. 1984, I think, is more of a commentary on fascist totalitarianism, really a dark, dark vision of what would have happened had Hitler been successful, or had the fascist totalitarian systems continued to spread throughout the world rather than be stopped during the Second World War. In any case, these are tremendously important works. Now, The Road to Wigan Pier. Let's talk specifically about this book. One of the colleagues that Orwell cultivated early in his writing career was a guy named Victor Gollancz. He was a publisher. In fact, he had his own publication firm called Victor Gollancz Ltd. I'm moving rooms here because I think there's enough background noise at this point that that could be distracting. I'm filming this at home and my kids are making noise, so my apologies. Anyway, Victor Gollancz was interested in Orwell's works, was involved in some of his earlier publications. I can't remember exactly which ones. I think Down and Out in Paris and London. Gollancz was associated with a political organization called the Left Book Club, which was interested in kind of exposing the inequities that existed in Britain at the time. And so it was Victor Gollancz who, after Orwell published his first couple of books, invited, or rather encouraged, kind of gave Orwell the idea, in any case, to go to the northern part of England, which is the industrial part of England. It's the poorer part. The southern part is the more populated part. It's also the part that historically has been far wealthier, associated with London and other cities, the university towns of Oxford and Cambridge, and the port cities of Dover and Portsmouth and Southampton and places like that. The northern part of England has a lot of coal mines, and so it was. I mean, this is the British, equivalent of like West Virginia. It was a more rural region, though it had also, during the Industrial Revolution, developed these large cities on the backs of the industrial workers in major factories. And so Manchester was sort of the quintessential industrial city of the Industrial Revolution period. And so he traveled in early 1936, from the end of January to the end of March, just a couple of months to the north of England. He spent several weeks boarding there in the city of Wigan, one of these mining towns. He also traveled to places like Leeds and Blackpool, I think. Anyway, several of these industrial cities close to the mines. He ended up going into the coal mines to observe the working conditions there, really as a kind of, expository reporter. That was the whole goal. He didn't really travel incognito necessarily. He just presented himself as a business traveler, I think. Not sure that he told people that he was writing a book about this. He was trying to get the authentic view of their lives. And part of this was in response to a lot of debates that were going on during the Great Depression, both in the United States and in Britain, and I assume in other places as well, over the role of government in trying to lift people out of poverty, debates about the nature of the poor themselves. There was a lot of criticism leveled against the poor, that they were doing very little to help themselves, that they were living the kinds of lives that would never get them out of poverty. There was criticism of the poor, that they were not actively seeking education or betterment or anything like that. These issues, by the way, should sound very familiar because they are still around today. We still talk about these kinds of things, and anytime you tune in to electoral politics in this country, you're going to find this kind of rhetoric going on. And so this is not something that is only germane to the Great Depression era and to George Orwell. The book that he wrote and published in the year after he did these travels, 1937, is made up of two parts. Part one is what we might call an expose of poverty. It consists of 7 chapters, and of course this is assigned reading, and so I'm not going to take you through a summary of everything, but there are he organizes each chapter around a specific issue about living the life of poverty, and so he talks about living conditions, about houses. He lodged for a time with a fairly poor family, but one who owned a house and rented out rooms, and he talked about the kind of frugality, the cruel frugality of these people, that they were trying desperately to make a living themselves, and so they treated their lodgers terribly. The conditions in the house were terrible. One of the more memorable scenes is that he says that at one point he walked into the kitchen to have breakfast, and there was a full chamber pot underneath the table, and the whole place just reeked of human waste. And so he decided to leave, that he was becoming depressed just from living there, that he was in some ways adopting the kind of beaten down mentality of those who lived there. He also has a chapter on conditions in the mines. The slide has a picture, I think, of an English coal mine that was taken around this time, and you can envision here, he talks about these coal miners who work on their knees and shovel the coal off of the coal face as the cutting machine cuts it through there, and the tremendous strain that this would put on one's torso and one's arms. He talks with some admiration about these miners. And in any case, there's a good deal of sort of horrific imagery in all of this. And he talks about wages as well. Politicians in this period who opposed more aid to poor people were, floating statistics, as politicians are usually wont to do, about how much money poor people actually made, and were insisting that these people needed to be more frugal with their resources, and so that was one of the excuses used to try to put off or deny any further government aid. He talks about he also talks about unemployment and deals with some of the misleading statistics that were being thrown around by politicians about unemployment. Probably my favorite chapter of the whole thing is when he talks about food. I think this is chapter 6. And he talks about the tendencies that poor people have to eat things that are not very healthy for them. And this is where I think we get into some of the things that Veblen was talking about. I think we can draw a lot of parallels between these two works, actually, but Veblen talked about people among the elites, among the wealthy, engaging in conspicuous consumption. That is, eating extravagant things that they really didn't need to eat, and that probably weren't terribly good for them, and that becomes kind of the standard of decency. And so when Orwell talks about people, rather than eating healthy things like whole wheat bread and vegetables and such things that are probably cheaper in some ways, they decide that they want to eat something that's tasty. In fact, he uses the word tasty. And so they, give up the precious little money they have to go out and buy white bread and margarine and tea. Tea in particular is he calls it the opium of the English. They go and buy ice cream and things like that because they want to feel happy for a brief moment in the midst of all of this misery. And he says we can't begrudge them that. This is sort of standard human behavior. This seems to be built into us, and there I think he may be in conversation, whether he means to be or not, with Veblen, and with this discussion about the standards of decency that come with conspicuous consumption as the ideal. So, in any case, those are kind of the major issues that he explores in Part 1. In Part 2, he shifts his focus, and this was somewhat controversial. He talks about socialism. After all, it was a socialist organization and a socialist publisher who requested that he do this study, that he do this expose of poverty. And so he says, is socialism a viable solution to the problems of poverty? That's his essential question he's asking there. And he even goes so far as to say, look, I am a socialist, or I think that socialism is a great idea. On an intellectual level, this absolutely works for me. It sounds wonderful. But it doesn't work. There are problems with it. There are problems with the approach of it. There are problems with the way that socialists tend to think. And he levels kind of 5 major criticisms at his fellow socialists, at people like Victor Gollancz and the members of the Left Book Club who funded this whole thing. And first of all, he says that these people, even though they claim to be the champions of the poor, really suffer like everybody else from class prejudice. And he uses the very stark language, kind of visceral language in this section when he's talking about these. He says socialists, and by this he means really kind of middle class, educated socialists who talk mostly about socialism on a conceptual level rather than a practical one. And so he says the reason that these socialists really will never be able to identify with the poor or help them in any substantial way is that they are prejudiced against them, because the poor smell bad. Now, this line was later used by his critics, including Victor Gollancz, who turned against him, to criticize Orwell himself, and this led to accusations of libel and kind of legal proceedings. But Orwell was trying to be, I think, just blatantly honest here, overtly honest in discussing this, and this was not well received. He criticizes the tendency of middle-class educated socialists to talk about the mechanization of labor as something that will solve all the ills of poverty. So he criticizes machines, or rather kind of the celebration of machines. He says that machines make the society soft, on the one hand, and they actually lead to higher unemployment because machines can do things on a level that many human beings cannot, and so the more we have machines, the more likely people are to lose jobs. These debates, by the way, are still around today as well. He criticizes the image cut by some socialists. He said these people don't present themselves very well, and here he's anticipating, I think, the kind of stereotype of the tree hugger, the left-leaning socialist, or leftist at least, who is a well, I don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes here, but he says some of the kind of the image that we cut, the way socialists present themselves, is not tremendously helpful. It's not something that working people can identify with, nor is it something that earns the respect of those other people in the middle class who are not friendly to socialism. He mentions that socialist writing is really bad, and here Orwell is writing in a vein that he did at times. He wrote a famous essay that was published posthumously called, oh gosh, what was the name of it? Rhetoric and the Art of Political Discourse, or something like that. The English language and the art. Anyway, it's about good writing, about the standards of writing. It's an essay that undergraduate students should probably read, actually. But he says socialists tend to use too much jargon and language that's opaque, and they can't get their points across. And they certainly can't communicate in this way with the working class whose interests they claim to be representing. And then finally, and most importantly perhaps, he says there is a fundamental disconnect between the educated middle-class socialists who approach this on a philosophical and intellectual level, and tend to be the main spokespeople for the whole socialist project, and the working people who just want to have a better life. And there certainly were working-class socialists in this period, but one of the things that Orwell points out is these people tend to be looked down upon by these intellectual socialists because they fail to maintain an intellectual purity of socialism. In other words, socialism becomes, as a philosophical system, becomes an end in itself rather than a means to the end. That he says some socialists would rather have a kind of pure socialist system than actually help people. Whereas the working class people just want to be treated better, they want to have higher wages, they want to have safer working conditions, they want to have better access to benefits, like healthcare and things like that, and they don't care about the intellectual purity of the political system that they claim to be ascribing to. Now, here again, I think we could, bring these criticisms forward into the present and see that there is, in many cases, a disconnect between the ideologues of a political party, say, or a political organization, and the people who make up the rank and file of that organization. These are charges that are often leveled against politicians, is that they are insisting too much on kind of the philosophical or intellectual purity of their stances, rather than actually meeting the practical needs of people. And this is one of the things that has, I think, contributed probably to gridlock in this country over the last, now many years. The first part of this book was very well received by the Left Book Club. The second part of the book drew so much frustration and ire and opprobrium from Victor Gollancz and the other socialists in his circle that Gollancz nearly refused to publish it. He told Orwell that he wanted to publish only the first part of it. When Orwell insisted that that be the case and they had a contract to do so, to publish it, Gollancz instead exercised his prerogative as publisher and wrote a foreword for it that ended up being included in the book, which really sort of qualifies the second part of Orwell's study and says, we don't ascribe to this, we don't agree with it, we think that Orwell has it all wrong. And that ended up being the introduction to the book. Orwell was not happy with this, understandably. He and Gollancz had a falling out at this point, eventually kind of brought legal proceedings against each other. It was a pretty ugly divorce between them, shall we say. And Orwell really kind of moved on at this point from writing about poverty, and I think that his experience with the Road to Wigan Pier might have been one of the main reasons that he abandoned this, or at least moved on to other issues. Now, I would encourage you at the end of this lecture to consider, as I've sort of hinted at throughout the lecture, consider the relevance of Orwell's arguments to modern political discourse, to questions about class struggle, questions about poverty. I am filming this in the summer of 2016. We're in the midst of a presidential campaign, and one of the major issues that politicians are talking about is what to do for the working classes who have lost their job. What do we do for coal miners in Virginia, in West Virginia and Ohio and places like that who have lost their jobs because, well, the coal seams have all been worked out, have been mined, and America has turned increasingly against the use of coal, though there's still plenty of it around. And the mechanization of mining has put a lot of people out of work, and obtaining natural resources from other countries via import has dealt another blow to the economic prospects of people who once could earn a middle class income by working these things, working these kinds of jobs. The same thing could be said to people who work in steel mills, which have closed in huge numbers. If you go to Pittsburgh today, for instance, you'll see that in the place where there used to be the most important steel mills in the country, we now have sort of a monumental nod to the smokestacks of the steel mills, but now we have kind of posh shopping centers and movie theaters and such things, where there once were these great bastions of industrialism. And there's a certain segment of this country who has never really recovered from that. The whole Rust Belt is in peril, because the basis of their economy has been, swept out from underneath them, like somebody pulling the rug out. And so, these people are left scrambling. What do we do? And I think Orwell really hits on a lot of the issues that a lot of people face in our contemporary circumstances. So look forward to seeing what all of you have to say and discussing this with you on the discussion board.